So moving right along in Kant, from the Analytical Concepts now to the Analytical Principles, in which Kant will begin to deal with the rules, the ground rules, the axioms and analogies and so forth, rules of the game for natural science, in other words. If you open up a copy of Euclid's Elements, the first thing you read are the definitions and the propositions and the common notions that basically lay out the ground rules for what Euclid is going to proceed to do in his construction of geometrical proofs. He's going to construct proofs. Kant will also use proofs coming up here pretty quickly. And the axioms and ground rules cannot themselves be proven. They're simply assumed. They are therefore the a priori rules of the game by means of which the game can be played. And I think something can be said for Kant's a priori rules as well, is that the history of science, the rules of the game were something that evolved gradually over time. But Kant is not a diachronic thinker. He's a synchronic thinker. He's a spatial thinker. He's not presenting science that way. He's presenting science, a cross-sectional, anatomical snapshot of science as it existed at the end of the 18th century, with all the rules of the game. He's giving you what the rules of the game are in order for science to generate discursive knowledge about objects, about any possible object in general that can become an object of science. In order for that to happen, it presupposes these a priori categories and judgments and types of judgments, and then together with their axioms, which I'll demonstrate in the next chapter, that generate knowledge about objects. This is why I think, consistent with my reading, continuing with my reading of Kant, rather, which disagrees somewhat with Schopenhauer's reading, in that I don't think he's concerned much with the way that the average, common, ordinary mind walking down the street has these categories to generate a world around him in space-time, subject to the law of causality, the way Schopenhauer does. Schopenhauer takes these Kantian principles, which Kant very much, I think, is concerned to limit to the elite world of the academy and how it processes knowledge and its a priori principles there, how knowledge in general can become objective. That's what he's concerned with, not so much the man in the street. Schopenhauer democratizes the Kantian principles to the man in the street and says, well, this is how everyone's mind works. If you get rid of all the categories except for causality, then you can extend it even to animals. Even animals have this, and the only thing that humans have that are different from animals is the faculty of Vernunft, which also Schopenhauer rather changes to mean simply the production of concepts, the ability to abstract concepts in the form of language, rather than the ideas of the reason. Now then, the next point is that, notice that for Kant, that one of the ways in which he's resolved the antinomy about innate ideas versus the tabula rasa is that there are indeed innate ideas, but they are not the ideas of the reason. They are not the ideas of God and the soul and freedom and immortality, those ideas which had held by the rationalists, such as Descartes, to be innate. Those ideas are not innate in Kant. The ideas that are innate are actually the ideas of science, the a priori concepts of the understanding that science uses to make and construct a world picture and to generate knowledge, discursive knowledge about any object in general that can become a possible object of knowledge for science. That's what he's concerned with, and the categories of the understanding become innate to the understanding. But they're empty in and of themselves unless they have intuitions or some kind of sense data that fill them out. And so in this next chapter coming up, which is the chapter on schematism, he gives us, he wants to know how precisely it is then that the concepts, the pure concepts of the understanding can interact or become filled out by intuitions, concrete objects. And so what he says is that the way in which this happens is that the imagination, last time we had seen how the imagination was this middle faculty between sensibility and the understanding. It's closer to sensibility than it is to the understanding. That confers a threefold synthesis on phenomena in order to render knowledge possible, knowledge about phenomena possible. The synthesis of apprehension and intuition is something that the imagination does. But the imagination, as Kant defines it, is that faculty of producing representations of objects that are now absent. So he's really concerned with how the mind produces knowledge here, not so much how it sees things walking down the street. And the imagination then has to confer synthetic unity on the manifold of the inner sense, and the form of the inner sense is time, the pure form of the inner sense, And it has to confer synthetic unity upon the manifold of all the representations that are in there through, first, the synthesis of apprehension, where it actually constructs an object that it then offers to the understanding. But it has to do that in accordance with the understanding, providing a rule from the concept that tells the imagination how then to perform that synthesis of apprehension. And simultaneously with that, of course, is the synthesis of reproduction, whereby the imagination maintains continuity, which is the sort of, not forgetting what you're doing in the process of apprehending a representation of some sort. If I think of a house, my imagination immediately goes to work producing, synthesizing on the manifold of my inner sense the image of a house. And it has to do that in accordance with a concept provided to it by the understanding, which gives it the rule for the synthesis. But now the schemata then are, as it were, the rules that the imagination produces that connect the understanding and its empty concepts on the one hand, or they may be empirical concepts, they may not be empty, but it connects the understanding and its concepts together with the intuitions, with the actual intuitions that the imagination produces through the threefold synthesis, and it gives it rules for doing this. So the schemata are the rules that the understanding gives to the imagination for the process of synthesizing images in the mind, so that it has them there to begin to form judgments about them, and then to form judgments about the construction of the scientific world picture. So some commentators have said that the schemata are redundant, they're superfluous, they're not necessary. But I think that in fact they are, because without them, as Kant says, you're just left with empty concepts of the understanding and images that are produced by the imagination. But then how does the imagination know how to produce the images? So for example, if I think of a triangle, if the imagination synthesizes through the synthesis of apprehension, produces a triangle, it's always a particular triangle. A scalene triangle, an equilateral triangle, or this or that triangle. So it always contains less in the image than is contained in the universal concept of a triangle, which contains all of those different types of triangle, in the definition that a triangle is three lines that are connected together in such a way that the three angles add up to 180 degrees. That contains much more universality in it, in an abstract sense, than the actual image that is produced in my imagination. So I need something in between these two, a kind of chalk outline, as it were, that is more sensuous than the concept, but not quite as sensuous as the image that the imagination produces. And that's also the rule of synthesis. Now, for empirical concepts, if I think of a dog, for example, this is an empirical concept, and the schemata then would then be a sort of chalk outline of a dog that tells my imagination to produce an image of a particular dog. So it's a kind of chalk outline when it comes to concrete, specific images. But now Kant says that the pure concepts of the understanding have no images. They don't correspond to images. So it can't be thought of as a figurative geometrical schemata. It has to be thought of, therefore, as a rule of synthesis. And this chapter is concerned with rules, with how the understanding works in terms of the application of rules. And it has to do then, so it has to produce a rule of synthesis that tells the imagination basically how to fill in time. Time is the form of the inner sense, and it's part of the manifold of synthesis that the imagination goes to work on. It has to fill out time in determinate ways, and the a priori concepts of the understanding and their schemata produced by the imagination, the schemata are produced by the imagination, tell it how to do that. So for example, the schema, Kant says, for quantity is number, and number is simply actually the schemata whereby the imagination proceeds to its activity of performing the synthesis by generating time in a successive sense through number. The schemata for quality is the degree of reality of a sensation. Remember, the categories of quality were reality, negation, and limitation. So sensation has to do with the continuous production of a sensation across a threshold of magnitude, or a diminishing of that sensation into negation where it disappears beneath the threshold of perception. But either way, it's this idea of a filling in of time with a sensation. So that's the schema for that. The schema for substance would be permanence in time, the idea of permanence in time. So the imagination has to proceed on its synthesis by coming up with something that is permanent through time, whereas cause and effect has to do with the necessary relation and succession of events through time, not just through time, but through time in a necessary manner, such as the event that follows the cause could not have followed in any other way. But it's the succession through time in a necessary manner, just as the schema that corresponds to the category of reciprocity is simultaneity of determinations in time. And then there are schemata also for the categories having to do with modality, such as possibility and actuality. There's schemata there. But in any case, you get the idea that the schemata are rules of synthesis for the filling in of time, for the construction of time, for its filling in, for its permanence. And time is the form of the inner sense, so the imagination has to know how to go about doing this, and it gets its rules from the understanding in purely conceptual form, but the concepts are different from the schemata. The schemata are the rules for the synthesis that tell the imagination then how to go about synthesizing all the representations and intuitions in the manifold of the inner sense, whose root, as we have seen, is the transcendental unity about perception. That is the sort of self that provides all of this with the stability and the fixity that enables the understanding to then dictate to the imagination how to produce the synthesis. So we can see then, this is a very introverted cosmology, and I think the more I read Kant, the less I see him talking about really how the mind perceives the outer world. I don't think he's so much concerned with that, the way Schopenhauer is. It's how the mind produces knowledge in a dialogue with itself by coming up with ideas and imagining them to itself, and then proceeding to form judgments about them in order to derive universal knowledge that becomes the basis for all the universal knowledge of the scientific world picture. So he's trying to give us rules for the formation of a scientific world picture, how science generates a picture of the world that's very different from how metaphysics does it, because metaphysics will try to ape the methods of science through the transcendental dialectic. And as he says, that the transcendental the understanding is concerned with the transcendental analytic, but the reason is concerned with the transcendental dialectic, which is an abuse of knowledge to try to use the ideas of reason by aping the methods of these rules of form production and the generation of a world through proving ideas like the existence of God and the infinity of the universe and so forth. All these things that it can't and should not do and can only do in a speculative way, because the ideas of the understanding, or rather the concepts of the understanding, are always rules of synthesis for a possible object in experience. And Kant reiterates this over and over again. The concepts of the understanding are meant to apply to objects of a possible experience. Anything that transcends the bounds of a possible experience, such as reason is concerned with in its ideas and its abuse in the transcendental dialectic, is outside the bounds of a possible scientific experience and therefore violates the rules of science. This is why it would turn out to be that there can be no science of metaphysics, for precisely that reason.